My name is Ronald Chen. I'm a professor of law at the law school and a faculty associate at the Eagleton Institute. I bring you greetings from John Farmer, the director of the Institute. It is my great pleasure to be the moderator for this event, in which we have a very distinguished panel that will discuss one of the many issues that is confronting us in this very suddenly full election season, which is the constitutional amendment that will be on the ballot as public question number 3 in New Jersey. And what it has to deal with is the possible effect on our elections process caused by the coronavirus, which, as we all know, is an aspect of life that has affected so much of our public processes and private processes. Let me first briefly frame the issue. As you probably know, every 10 years, the Constitution requires that the federal government conduct a census, an enumeration of all persons living in the United States, and the numbers of that census are used each year to apportion representation, both at the federal level and also used at the state level to allocate and draw maps for the legislative districts. That occurs every 10 years. Because of the coronavirus, it has already been made clear that the process of the census has been affected and delayed by the coronavirus. There was at one point a suggestion from the Bureau of the Census that they might not be able to present data until July 2021, although I think they may have revised that figure. That presents particular problems for at least 2 states, New Jersey and Virginia, because those are the 2 states that hold state legislative elections in the year following the census, in this case in the year 2021. And the question then arises whether the maps for the state legislative districts could be drawn in time if the data from the census is in fact delayed, which has led to the proposed constitutional amendment that the public will vote on in November that would allow, under certain circumstances, for use of the existing map, the one that has been in effect for the past 10 years, to be used for an additional 2 years if the census data is not available by February 15th. To discuss this issue, we have a very distinguished panel. We first have Assemblyman John McKeon, representing the 27th latest legislative districts and one of the primary sponsors of this bill. We also have Jessie Burns, the executive director of the League of Women Voters of New Jersey. We have Assemblyman Christopher DePhillips, representing the 40th legislative district. Hanal Patel, who I will say one of my former students, who is the director of Democracy and Justice at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, and Professor Samuel Wong from Princeton University, the director of the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. And I welcome you all and thank you so much for participating in this event. For our audience, the format we follow for these is that I will first invite the panelists to give a brief presentations. I'm going to suggest maybe 7 or 8 minutes for each one initially. During that time, after that time, I may pose some questions to the panel, and I will invite them not only interact with me, but with each other if they like. You all also see a box in your window marked Q&A, and I'll be watching that, and thereafter we'll have the opportunity for you to pose questions to members of the panel. If you want, you can specify whether the question is for the entire panel or a particular member of the panel. And at the end, we'll invite the panelists to give brief closing remarks. We will definitely end by 1:30. So for a variety of reasons, I have everyone's agreed. I think it is best that we start with Assemblyman McKeon and ask him perhaps to explain what the constitutional amendment is that the legislature has proposed to the people. Oh, hold on. Okay. McKeon, sorry.
Thank you, Dean Chen. Thank you so very much. And it's an honor to be a part of the Eagleton's webinar today, as it's an honor to be along with the esteemed panelists that you've gathered. You were kind enough to reference that 4 or 5 of us have been very publicly against this constitutional amendment. So I thank you for allowing me to go first and perhaps having some rebuttal time thereafter. And I know that you'll handle things absent personal opinions in a very judicious fashion. I have no doubt that's the case. You referenced in your opening, our United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, if my history is correct, that mandates that there be a census of all persons, key being all persons in this country. If you're a history buff, as I am, as probably everybody on the panel and even listening to us is, it's very interesting. The first census actually took place after just 3 years, and the reason being is that the states themselves conducted it, and there was some concern because that was going to be the way the Revolutionary War debt was going to be retired, that they were accurate. But when you balance that against the right number of congressmen was going to be based on population, they thought everybody would be honest, and they were. And as they say, the rest is history. After that, it's been every 10 years. And believe it or not, welcome to 2020. This is the 24th census conducted by the United States government. Now, it's obviously going to be a year different than any other. Our state was put on notice back in May that as opposed to the army of 500,000 federal employees that would go door to door to complete this count, that they were looking for that to be delayed. And they told us that to be the case because, as you referenced, Virginia and New Jersey, who redistrict the same year that the census data becomes available, we're usually first in line, and give or take, hopefully sometime in February of that year, we get a number and then go ahead with our own crazy process. And we learned that that date was going to be no earlier than June 15th. And as such, we were required to make an adjustment. It wasn't a problem created by anyone other than the terrible circumstances we find ourselves in with this year. I think everybody on the panel, and I'm going to talk about things I think we do agree on. The Brennan Center for Justice, which is beyond reproach and is the paragon of transparency, indicated New Jersey and Virginia are going to need to do something. And we did. So this is my approach, and I'm going to, again, try to find common ground among all of us. And it's ironic that we're speaking today after a court decision that, or at least a hearing that happened just yesterday. All of us here collectively would say if New Jersey is undercounted and we were to lose a member of the congressional delegation, that would be a disaster for our state. All of us agree, even if it didn't get that to that extent, if we were undercounted, we would be talking about billions of dollars of federal aid, which is already not proportionately sent to our state by our federal government, would be lost. So we all, as a state, have so much at stake based upon an accurate count. Sadly, once again, the Trump administration is meddling with what should be nonpartisan process. We had Tim Olson, a senior executive with the Census Bureau, saying at a minimum we need to December 31st. The Trump administration said, tough, you're going to cut it off October 31st. Notwithstanding that there's an injunction, they're going ahead and firing some of already the census takers, many of whom they're a lot less than they needed to start with. So it is a disaster unfolding. The attorney from the Justice Department badgered the judge to say, listen, just deny it because I'm going up on appeal. So keep that in mind as a backdrop that we all collaboratively have to be vigilant as it relates to making sure there's an accurate count. Not only is it mandated by our Constitution, but as a practical matter, we have so much at stake in New Jersey. And quite frankly, this constitutional amendment has, to me, a tangential benefit, because if the people of this state support it, then we'll have a legal basis, in my view, based upon us expressing our opinions as an electorate to fight whatever it is that the administration might try to do in hoisting undercounted numbers. As it related to the solution, listen, it's less than perfect. I've been, crazy as it sounds, I'll have been in the legislature for 20 years at the end of this term. And I've gone through redistricting once as a brand new candidate when at the last minute these districts change, and as it happened again, 10 years thereafter. And for people that already have a mechanism set up, it's pandemonium to start with. And to look at numbers that would come in June and to be able to follow that processes as it relates to how compressed that would be, would to me be as undemocratic as it could possibly be. I know I just have 8 minutes, so I'll wait maybe to the rebuttal to explain as to why indeed I believe that to be the case. So again, with not a lot of options, this is a solution to go to that date of the 15th. If we don't have the numbers by then, which by all accounts we unlikely will be, absent some bogus numbers being thrown at us, we will then have the commission appointed in due course. However, the independent, assuming the members won't come up to their own agreement, which isn't going to happen, will then not certify that map maybe as late as March of the following year. Again, that will have a tangential benefit of hearings, more transparency. And I tell you all something that we probably have in common. If I was the king, the Redistricting Commission would look different. But guess what? If we didn't take the step that we did, it was just going to be as it always was. So there'll be a lengthy process that will go beyond anything we had before. And we will have, elections in the due course that will just delay our redistricting by 2 years, creating an 8-year cycle. And with that, I think this is a good time to stop. Again, I think everybody on this panel is going to be thoughtful as to their views and opinions. There's nothing perfect here, but we're living in imperfect times. So again, I thank you for being a part of this and look forward to spirited discussion.
Thank you very much, Assemblyman. Let's go next to Jesse Burns, the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of New Jersey.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Eagleton for having me today. And I do want to just express that I have a great deal of respect for Assemblyman McKeon. We're often on the same side of many issues. We just have a different opinion today, but I'm happy to be here respectfully discussing it. So a little bit about Fair Districts New Jersey that I wanted to mention. Started in 2017, Fair Districts New Jersey is a nonpartisan coalition fighting to reform New Jersey's redistricting process. So Fair Districts New Jersey is a project of the League of Women Voters, which I'm the executive director of. Our organization has been involved in redistricting for decades. We believe that redistricting needs to be impartial, transparent, inclusive, community-driven, and fair. Through our People-Powered Fair Maps campaign, which is a national campaign, the League is on the ground right now working for community-driven redistricting reforms in all 50 states. So we're grappling with these questions around how to handle the census and the pandemic and redistricting reforms in every state across the country. This is our largest campaign since the League's founders worked to pass the 19th Amendment. So as we know, in New Jersey, the power to draw the district legislative map currently belongs to 10 partisan appointees selected by the chairs of the state parties, the Republican and the Democratic parties. And the commission consists of politicians and party operatives working behind closed doors, developing a map that advances their party's political goals. There is a tiebreaker, as was mentioned by both Ron and the Assemblyman, who joins at a later process. But as the process currently stands, it lacks significant key components of a fair process, namely transparency, clear and robust line drawing standards, safeguards against gerrymandering, meaningful public input, and accountability measures. So I bring this up just because I want to, again, stress that the League has been working for decades towards a more inclusive, transparent process. And this particular ballot question does not address any of these problems. Instead, it causes additional complications to an already flawed system. And while, yes, it's meant to address a possible delay in census, it's not clear that the census data will be significantly delayed. Problems caused by the proposal, the ballot question number 3, and the reason that the League is recommending a no vote is that first and foremost, I think it's that this change is made permanent. So this is not a one-time solution to a extraordinary problem, the pandemic. Every time that New Jersey receives the data past February 15th, which by the way is a courtesy date, there's nothing that mandates that we receive data by that date. And in fact, in the past, we have not. Existing districts are going to remain in effect for another 2 years. Additionally, that trigger date, as I'll refer to it, of February 15th, is really early. There are significantly later dates where moving the primary election could still be an option, and indeed it was in past election cycles. The second problem with this is that New Jersey's population is much more racially diverse than it was 10 years ago. I believe that other panelists might have exact numbers, so I'll leave it to that. But extending these current district lines for 2 years means that these populations are going to not be accurately reflected or politically represented for those additional 2 years. I also want to just address some of the problems with the census for a second. Nothing in this ballot question presents any solutions to any possible problems with the census data. And to be clear, the census has been problematic, and advocacy groups, the League, has been sounding the alarm since at least 2017. From being underfunded to the addition of the citizenship question to problems that the census faces now as a result of the pandemic. These problems with the census are not new. The League's involved, as well as the Brennan Center, with litigation around the country to try to address any kind of flaws in the data. This proposal doesn't ensure that the Census Bureau delivers a complete and accurate count, nor does it address any of the low self-response rate in New Jersey's hard-to-count communities. In addition, it offers no reforms to help make the process more inclusive or transparent. It doesn't give us any, doesn't give us a redistricting process that's thoughtful, deliberative, or inclusive. It doesn't encourage public participation or public input. It doesn't ensure that communities of color are fairly represented in 2021, 2022, or going forward. It doesn't improve diversity in the legislature, and it does nothing to counter the president's recent memo excluding undocumented individuals from the apportionment count. So there are a number of significant flaws in this particular proposal, and while I understand the intentions behind it, it ultimately becomes a situation of two wrongs simply not making a right. The flawed census, we can't risk the integrity of one of our democratic systems, redistricting, because the integrity of our census is in question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Let's go next to Assemblyman Christopher DePhillips.
Thank you, Ron. Appreciate it. I'd like to thank Eagleton for the kind invitation to be on the panel today. I'm a huge fan of Eagleton and the great work it does in the area of public policy. I'm especially happy to be on the panel today with my colleague, Assemblyman John McKeon. John and I are friends, colleagues, fellow lawyers, and we believe wholeheartedly in civility and professionalism in politics, which is a very good thing because we have agreed to disagree on this issue. So bottom line, I do not believe we should take the unprecedented step to amend the Constitution permanently to delay redistricting. And I'm sure we'll get into all the details and all the arguments pro and con as we move forward with our discussion today. But in a nutshell, in my opinion, this complicated scheme of a constitutional amendment is a classic example of putting the cart before the horse. The amendment is entirely built on speculation that the Census Bureau, whether under President Trump or under President Biden, will be unable to provide census data to New Jersey by an arbitrary February 15th date, which, by the way, has no meaning under federal law. Let me just add a few more points. Late census data is really nothing new in New Jersey. In 2001, it happened, and we simply pushed back the primary. In 2011, we simply pushed back the petition filing date. But here, the resolution, the amendment, offers permanent constitutional changes under the guise of the pandemic. If this were really about the pandemic, this resolution would have offered a one-time fix, but it does not do that. So I'm going to stop there. I know Assemblyman McKeon has heard my arguments before in the Judiciary Committee and on the floor of the State Assembly. So I look forward to any rebuttal he may have or any questions that the other panelists may have, and of course, questions from the audience. So Ron, thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Hanal Patel from the Institute for Social Justice. What say you?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I am honored to be on this panel with these esteemed panelists and to be here at Eagleton, where I was a student at one time, so this is exciting for me. I'm here to testify, I mean, not to testify, I wanted to say we testified against this amendment when it was in the legislature, and I'm here to discuss why we did that and why we think voters should vote no. So the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, we are a racial justice organization here in New Jersey. We are committed to working on issues to solve a lot of the problems that are inherent in our system. So from closing the racial wealth gap to addressing our criminal justice system to, in the pillar I work with, to ensuring that we have a government that represents and reflects the people of the state of New Jersey. So we are here today, and the reason to discuss this redistricting amendment, a permanent change to our Constitution that is on the ballot that now voters have to consider. And it is something that we knew coming into this process, since April, we knew that something may have to be done to address our redistricting process. As has been discussed from the beginning, New Jersey, Virginia, we're in a unique situation. We redistrict earlier than everyone else. We're required to because of our off-year elections. So we need the data early. And it is, the Census Bureau does provide it to us as a courtesy earlier than most of the other states. And that's just the normal process in every single cycle. We came into this year, we had this unprecedented pandemic, a pandemic that is affecting communities of color more than anyone else, including right here in New Jersey, where Black and Brown communities are are being affected more by the pandemic than any other group. And we knew that they had to delay the census count, and we knew there might be some thing that needed to be done here. But then, and this is the solution that was proposed, and it doesn't work. So while the stated need for this amendment is the delay in the census caused by COVID-19, the amendment here is a permanent change that will be in effect decades after COVID-19 is hopefully behind us. Should the Census Bureau in 2031, so in 10 years from now, or any other future cycle deliver redistricting data, even a day later than February 15th, we would be forced to conduct an election using the old map that would no longer represent the population of this state. The purpose of redistricting is to ensure that we have a government that is representative of the people of the state. It is why we must have districts of equal population, districts that keep communities of interest together, and why people of color must not be apportioned in a way that dilutes their ability to elect candidates of their choice. Redistricting is about representation and, in turn, power. So every time we redistrict after a census, it's to account for shifts in our population because people move. So it matters what the population changes that have happened in the last 10 years. We are now more diverse than we were 10 years ago. People of color, communities of color in the state of New Jersey make up 45% of the population. That is an increase from 10 years ago, and it matters that people have the opportunity to be represented. Now, we've discussed the problem we were in. And it's true, we came into this, this is unprecedented times, and COVID has affected just about everything, every part of what we're dealing with, including, even our legislative cycle. Our legislators weren't able to take the normal break that they usually do in the summer after the budget season. We are now pushing through, and because this is the reality we're living in, everyone in the state of New Jersey has been adapting to deal with this pandemic. So we knew coming in we might have to do some changes, perhaps move the primary, the dates of the election next year, depending on when we're getting the data. Perhaps do something along the line of maybe a one-off type of amendment. The issue here is that of the options on the table, and some of which still exist, still are on the table if the census data is delayed a bit. The option here, the one on the ballot, is the only option where the only people harmed, the only people asked to make a sacrifice are communities of color. Everybody else, it doesn't really harm anyone else. It just keeps things going. White populations in the state, they're not harmed. If anything, they continue to have representation from a map drawn 10 years ago when they made up a greater part of the population. Elected officials, candidates, they get some clarity in when they're going to run. No changes. But communities of color are asked to wait 2 years. 2 years in order to have representation that is due to them, and this amendment won't fix the issues that are actually a problem here. It is an issue. It is absolute issue. And I agree with Assemblyman McKeon on that it is a problem that we are not sure when the census is going to be over at this point. It might be over, at the end of this month after yesterday's decision, the decisions happening in the federal court in California. It might be at the end of October. There is uncertainty here, and it is crucial for us to work towards ensuring a full count. It is. We've been working at the Institute. We've been working on census outreach for this census for years now. We've been doing this work on the ground, working with partners to make sure that we have a full count. It is so important to both billions of dollars in funding and also our representation for these communities. But this amendment doesn't do any. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't change when the Census Bureau will complete the data or when it will deliver the data. It doesn't affect that at all. That is a federal issue here. And at this point, we actually do not know when we are going to get the data. That is absolutely clear. Yes, the administration wants it by December 31st. Even if we are still counting until October 31st, they do not seem to be willing to push that. There are bills to push to give the Census Bureau the time they need, but we don't know what's going to happen there. So we don't know how, if the data will be delayed next year, and if it is delayed, how much it'll be delayed. It might just be delayed a little while, wherein we might be able to just change our primary. We just had a delayed primary this year, and we were fine. It was the second highest turnout in our primary history. We can do that again next year, depending on when we get the data. It is completely possible, considering that we don't know what's going to happen, and certainly better than putting a change on the ballot that will be a permanent change that might not even go into effect next year. If we do happen to get the data before February 15th, then if this ballot question passes, it won't even go into effect next year, and we might just be kind of stuck with it 10 years from now. It might haunt us for cycles to come. So it doesn't help. It doesn't solve any of the issues that are actually before us. And then to reiterate what was mentioned earlier, there have been efforts to bring reform to our process. We hear about redistricting and redistricting reform around the country. New Jersey is, I like to say, it's not terrible. Our redistricting process, it's not the best, it's not ideal, but it's not bad. There are lots of places where it's much worse. A bipartisan commission is not a really bad, it's not terrible. It's a decent, it's okay. I like to say it's okay, but it could be so much better. It should be better. It needs to be better. And part of what it needs to have is a process that centers around community voices, that has transparency and public participation built in. Not just, oh, we have time for it and maybe they'll do it by bylaws, but built in, required, so that the public has accountability here. From the commission itself, we should have a process that centers around racial equity, especially as we are now a very diverse state, and we are becoming more diverse every year, every 10 years. We need a process that doesn't allow, maybe sitting legislators onto the commission, because legislators shouldn't be able to draw their own districts. It's a better principle, but that's perhaps my opinion. But we need a process that can do that. Reform efforts, and there have been, with the Fair Districts Coalition, which the Institute does sit on, has been working for years. There have been proposals for reform for years. There was an opportunity. If not all of it, there could have been here in this amendment before it was in the ballot. They could have, the legislature could have added some factors of reform in there. It was completely possible to kind of build in, public hearings of transparency. They could have built that in, but it didn't. So now we have here something that doesn't do that, something ostensibly because of COVID, but is a permanent change. So, and will harm communities of color, deny them their fair representation, which they are owed immediately. So we think you should know.
Thank you. Professor Wong. You're on mute.
Am I okay now?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Ron. Thank you for President Chen, I should say. And thanks to all the other panelists. It's really a pleasure to be here. My name is Sam Wong, and I am a professor at Princeton University, and I direct the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. For those of you who don't know, the Gerrymandering Project is a policy group that combines law, math, and data to help bring about fairer districting nationwide. And we have resources in all those domains. And we're delighted to be here on home turf to talk about today's proposed constitutional amendment. And I should say that we are always ready to give assistance, whether it be redistricting along the way, or also maybe in the crafting of legislation. Now, ACR 188, this thing that we're going to be voting on, it's Amendment 3, is that right? On the November ballot. This legislation is already crafted, and so the horse has left the barn. But as someone from the sidelines, I get to kibitz and say what I think about these things. A lot of what I'm going to do is in some ways reiterating what other panelists have said, but I'm hoping to put some hard data on some of these statements and maybe, I hope, bring some clarity to some of these issues that have been brought up. This is a difficult time in our nation's history, and it's a really unusual time, not only because of coronavirus, but also political division. There are all kinds of reasons to be concerned about the current national scene, including here in New Jersey. And I would say in the face of a delayed census, there is this phrase that people sometimes say, do something, do anything. And I think that our team would be generally in favor of doing something, but we're not really all that enthusiastic about doing anything. And so what I want to do is get into a little bit what happened here and what the impacts of this amendment would be. Now, the status quo right now is the federal government is said to have to deliver data by April 1st. That's the usual deadline. As said before, it can be delivered somewhat earlier to New Jersey out of courtesy. What New Jersey does in normal years is then redistrict for an election that year. And in some deep sense, having elections in our state in an odd-numbered years gives us a jump on the rest of the country, where we get to have representation reflect new census numbers a year before everyone else. And what this amendment does is it puts in place a trigger mechanism to put us 1 year later than other states in the country. And so let me just go to my slides and let's see if I can do it. Maximo, if you can let me show my slides, or if you show them, either is okay with me, but one or the other. So my share button is not activated. So somebody needs to help me with my slides. All right, thank you. All right, so if we put this into, if we put this into show the fourth slide, please. So this, yeah. So this is just to give you a sense of the deadline. Now, as Assemblyman DePhillips said, there have been years when the federal government has not quite met the deadline that we're used to getting. And so I just want to walk you through this. I don't want to necessarily bore you with all the details in this, but just to call your attention to the column under 2021 where it says July primary. And this is just to show you that if the federal government were to meet its national statutory deadline of providing data by April 1st, then it would still be possible to have a July primary. It would still be possible for 137 days for there to be testimony to this Redistricting Commission, that Hanai Patel was just talking about. And it would be possible to have 112 days from the primary to the general. So that is somewhat shortened, but I would say that, is it short enough to inconvenience legislators who may not like to have a shorter primary season? I couldn't really say. It is even possible to have data delivered as late as July 1st, and with effort, suck our guts in and just really do whatever it takes to get everything done. One could, in theory, have a July 1st data delivery and have a 2-month primary to general season and seat legislators in time for January 11th. Now, the deadline in this amendment is much earlier, as we have already heard. It's February 15th. It's before the July 1st date I just hypothetically spelled out. It's before April 1st, the federal deadline, and it's even before dates that the data have been delivered to New Jersey in past years. And so it's a really pretty early deadline. And so I guess I have to admit, I'm a little bit curious about exactly why the date was set so early. It strikes me as something that is going to be triggered in future years when we don't have a pandemic. And I'm optimistically assuming that in 10 years, we're not going to have a pandemic, also in 20 years. And we'll see about that. But it strikes me as a solution that solves a problem that doesn't quite exist. Now, let me go back to 2 slides previous, and let me just show you. Okay, so this is now just to show you, Hanai Patel is just talking about changes in the population of New Jersey. These are the kinds of changes that at some point, whenever redistricting does happen, will be represented in new district lines. The biggest changes are increasing diversity in our state, where the total state population has not changed that much. But according to the American Community Survey, which is another Census Department product where we do have estimates, there have already been in the last 10 years substantial changes in the Hispanic, Latino, and the Asian populations, where both populations have increased by more than 25%. And so there's really been a booming of populations, and you can see that these population increases are mostly concentrated in the northern part of the state. On the left, you can see Hispanic and Latino population increases in that red zone of 2 to 5% of the total population. On the right, you can see Asian population changes here in the central part of the state where I am, and also in places like Edison, New Brunswick, Princeton, and so on. And so those are where Asian populations have changed. And this is growth that is 400,000 people. That's enough people, if they were all in one place, to fill 3 assembly or Senate districts. And so, this is a lot of population change. This is 3 districts full of people. Now, they're not all in specific districts. So let's go to the one more slide that I want to show before I'm done. And so let's go to the next slide. And this is just a lot of text, but just to give you a sense of it, Hispanic and Latino populations have increased by more than 5% of the total county population in Bergen, Passaic, and Union counties. And let's see, I'm sorry, this is like a little bit mangled here, but let me just skip on and say that Asian populations have also increased by more than 5% of the county population in a number of counties. And in total, I think this is important from a voting rights perspective, in 11 out of 21 counties, the combined Black, Latino, and Asian population will exceed 37%. And that's really interesting from a voting rights perspective, because once you get to 37%, researchers who study voting rights are of the opinion that it's potentially enough to start building a coalition district. And there are new additions to this district, Bergen and Somerset counties. And so those are counties where there is this potential for ability to elect districts and potential for the district lines to reflect the diversity of the state. And so that's an opportunity that with this amendment is likely going to be changed by being pushed back a couple of years. And so the cost of passing this amendment in terms of is representational, where there are these counties where these demographic changes will take time to be reflected. Now, the last thing I want to say is that There are a lot of issues that are not addressed, as we've already heard, things having to do with money paid to the states, having to do with the census count, concerns having to do with an undercount, and reforms to the Redistricting Commission. Broadly, I would say that one issue with this is that this legislation is drafted without knowing what's going to happen next year. And as Yogi Berra says, prediction is hard, especially of the future. And I think that in some ways, if this doesn't pass, another route to relief would be seeking relief from the New Jersey Supreme Court. I think that there's a pretty active Supreme Court in this state. And I think that legislators, especially those who sponsor this legislation, I think that they would find common cause. I think those who are opposed to this amendment include communities of color and also the minority caucus in Trenton. And so it feels to me like there are a lot of options for seeking relief and crafting a good solution to whatever problems we might be facing next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wong. I want to give Assemblyman McKeon, as the proponent of the bill, alas, unfortunately, in this panel, perhaps the only one, a chance to respond to some of what he's heard. Oh, and go ahead. Sorry.
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity, and again, thanks to all of my panelists for their thoughtful points to be made, and I would like to address several of them. And I heard a lot of nice things, but when Chris DePhillips talked about how we can disagree but be cordial and respect one another and like one another, I wish that that would have a little bit of infection down in Washington and maybe among a lot of the populace now. Professor Wong, I just want to go right to what you said, because I'm sure you didn't mean to misspeak about any caucus in the legislature or minority caucus being opposed to this. As a matter of fact, at the public hearings, Senators Ruiz, Poe, and Cruz Perez, the three Latino women of the caucus, were very passionate in speaking for this. Senator Ron Rice, and I think his credentials are well known, spoke passionately in favor of this, as did Senator Vin Gopal, the only Asian member of our Senate. As a matter of fact, my co-sponsors represent the majority of the persons of color and Latinos in the Assembly, and each of those, every member of minority member of the Democratic caucus, which number 40%. Basically 22 of 52 in the Assembly and 9 of 25 in the Senate, 31 or out of 77 total, 100% voted for this. So that doesn't mean that people can't feel differently, but all of them who are persons of color felt as if this was the appropriate step to be taken and support this legislation. I want to just go back to Ms. Burns, who had talked about much of what we could have put in this concerning all of our issues with the Census Bureau. I wish we could have, but we don't have that ability. The Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution would preclude us from doing something that would be inconsistent with that. And why we're talking about constitutional law, because a lot of the panelists raised this, equal protection in the sense of voter redistricting is nothing but a legal fiction. The day that we adapt a new map, regardless of when that happens, and this could go back to Professor Wong's point, populations change. So that happens right from the very beginning of a new map being adopted. It's just the way that population progresses. Relative to some of the other alternatives, again, I started off by saying if I was king, there's a lot of consensus here about a different type of redistricting commission that would be less partisan and more independent. I'm not the king, and none of us were able to move the legislature in a way to make those kind of changes. Two great things about this. One is that, as I suggested earlier, it won't be a 30-day sprint with the independent and making his decision or her decision. It'll be as many as 8 to 10 months, giving the opportunity for more transparency and input. And furthermore, we do and would have 2-year cycles to be able to go forward with our own additional reforms to the commission, if not in membership, as it relates to manners in which that we would expect them to proceed. And so the elephant in the room to me, and it's a solid argument, I think, that you can all make, why not just 1 year? And I thought a lot about that in going in this direction. And it was because I don't like to trifle with the Constitution. If it's going to be a constitutional amendment, something that was 1 year, just viscerally didn't feel right to me. And then secondly, I thought of the consequences of that. And if what was to be an 8-year cycle that was a well thought through map turns out to be a 10-year cycle, I don't think that the negative of that would be outweighed by the positive. Now, all that said, there's nothing permanent. The great news is that beyond what we might do in the next couple of years, and I hope we do, we have a full 10 years to get it right relative to what the Redistricting Commission is going to look like in the future, as well as if there's that much of a groundswell to, again, over 10 years, amend the Constitution back to just leave that date open. My last point on that is February 15th is not fun. If you really, and I know everybody is speaking that way in earnest, are about getting more minority representation. And just this is an interesting fact, by the way, the legislature as it's currently constituted is actually disproportionately represented by African Americans compared to what the demographic shows. African Americans are about 15% of our population, and they're about 23% of our state legislature. But if you really care about that kind of diversity being reflected in the composition of our legislature, then you won't want us to go much beyond any February 15th date. Do you know how hard it is to be able to all of a sudden run out and get petitions? Here's my new district. I'm going to run out and get petitions. I'm an unknown, so I'm going to have to raise money. Those February 15th dates or anytime God knows after that are an incumbent's dream as it relates to being at a significant competitive advantage. So this is actually helpful to what those have argued would be harmful to the process. The last point, and then I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody has to say. And again, this goes to Professor Wong, because I read, and I love the work you do and read about it. And who am I to question a Princeton professor, some dummy that went to Muhlenberg College? But relative to December election, you know who does that? Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Texas. They do it through this cockamamie runoff process. And guess what? When they delay the election beyond when it usually is to December, there's a 35% decrease in those who vote, and those who devote end up being older, whiter, and wealthier. So be careful what you wish for, knowing what your intention is as it relates to how that translates in states that do have elections that come out of cycle. So with that, again, I'll do my best to talk with everybody.
Thank you very much, Assemblyman. There was one request from the audience, which I think is objective. I think I just can take care of it now. If it wasn't clear, what we're really talking about now is the scheduling of the redistricting process for the state legislature, for the state legislative districts, because we're going to be doing that under our state constitution, electing them in November 2021. It really doesn't affect too much the redistricting process for our federal members of the House, because that takes place a year later, the time element. Heaven forfend that the delay in the census should affect that election. Then we'll all be then we'll all be in trouble. For various reasons, I think we all agree in that. I'll just pose, because I want to. We have 25 minutes left, and I want to give time for closing statements, and we have a number of questions. So maybe I'll just pose one question each to one to Assemblyman McKeon and one to the rest collectively, since you have similar positions. It'll be a general question, maybe the one to the rest. Like, we're in, I think you've all said, we're in a situation of big unknowns. We don't know right now when the census is going to come. So I'll ask rhetorically, what is the choice? What choice did the legislature have but to make for some provision, albeit perhaps not exactly the one that perfect one, in case the Census Bureau is delayed and the census data is delayed, and with the effect of a very delayed election and therefore a very compressed election process, might that have a deleterious effect, especially on communities of color? And I guess the question I was going to pose to you, Assemblyman McKeon, and you begin to answer, but I'll give you another chance, is it's sort of a flip of the same thing. I think everyone recognizes we're in terra incognito this year, but why not just have a provision that was effective for this election and not for 2031, 2041, etc.? Does that not sort of put into stone a process whereby, frankly, theoretically, the decision of a federal official in Washington of when to put the census data in the mail determines what districts we use? So I'll and on this, I'll also invite, if members of the panels want to pose questions to each other, that would be fine too. So Professor Wong. Oh, wait, can we check Professor Wong's mute?
Am I unmuted now?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. I wanted to ask something that's relevant to Assemblyman McKeon's question, and also to your point, Professor Chen, which is that an election in December might have difficulties of the type that Assemblyman McKeon has outlined, but data could be delivered, as far as we can tell, as late as April 23rd, and still lead to a regular election date. And that's after the federal deadline of April 1st. And as Ron has just put it, making a deadline earlier gives President Ivanka Trump 20 years from now the power to determine when we do our redistricting. And I think the horse has left the barn, and so we're going to be voting on this in November. But I'm just curious as to the thinking about why this deadline was set so early in February 15th, when April 1st, potentially would have been a date that would have allowed public input, allowed a November election, and kept President Ivanka Trump from doing this, or President, I don't know, Hunter Biden, or whatever you might want to say about some future president, President AOC. So I think Ron and I are asking the same question: why so early, and why give away power to the feds?
Well, is that question posed to me? Yes.
If you'd like to, Assemblyman McKeon.
Yeah, sure. I'm hoping that it's President DePhillips. By the way, that would be my.
Well, then please show mercy at that time.
Yeah, Professor, I'm not certain that if it was, what's the next month after February? March 1st, would it probably, to me, just having gone through the process twice, even at a February 1st date or 15th date, that starts to get to the point when things are so compressed and so intensive that it doesn't lead to a real thoughtful process by the Redistricting Commission. It's rushed, and anything that has to happen that quick, in my experience, actually is a disadvantage to those who might be placed in new districts, to give them the opportunity to have representation more commensurate with the demographic of the population. So
but the commission can form in January. The commission can still form at any time.
The commission will just, again, going by our experience, never move any sooner than the 60 days that they're given to go. And again, we have, now if this passes, an extended process. Where this might go, just other two quick points. Number one, I heard you say before, well, why don't we turn to the New Jersey Supreme Court? I respect them, but at the end of the day, you're leaving it to how many of them there is that are unelected individuals who get to make that choice. In this instance, this is the elected legislature putting forth a question for 9 million people to get to vote on. So to me, this was a more democratic way to do it than it would be just to kind of throw it in the lap of the court, as capable as they might be and as fair as they might be, to do something different. If this is defeated, that's where it's going to end up, truth be told. And again, I know as I sit here that this Trump administration is going to do something to end up giving us flawed numbers. And at least if this passes, it gives us the ability, I think, to go to federal court to try to not be accepting of those numbers. That's my view. Which, by the way, and can I make one last point? Which, by the way, although I'm surprised nobody argued this, the numbers in New Jersey now were apparent that we're getting back in the census percentage-wise are better than they were 10 years ago, except according to ironically, the New Jersey Institute of Social Justice, which one of our esteemed panelists is a part of, except the communities of color are well below where they were 10 years ago. So tell me who's going to be undercounted when we get hoisted on this by the feds.
Ms. Patel, do you want to say anything?
Absolutely. As I said earlier, it's the census and working towards a full census count is incredibly important. So I'll just take a second to say we might have only about 7 days. So if you know anyone who hasn't taken the census, urge them to do so. We need them to take it. And that is something we are actively working on. Yes, our rate around the state is a little higher than it was. The self-response rate is a little higher than it was 10 years ago. Communities of color, the self-response rate is lower, although it's changed in the last couple of weeks. There are certain cities have beat it, a couple of them, and others are much lower, and that is a problem. We are working on that. I want to highlight something, though, on this. 2 points, and it relates to something Assemblyman McKeon said earlier as well. So, yes, we are dealing with a terrible situation in terms of a possible undercount. But, and I'm going to say this very carefully. In 2010, we also did not have a full count. The self-response rate for Irvington, for example, was 50% in 2010. We redistricted with those numbers. We have that map, and now we want to continue using that map for 2 years, and nobody had a huge issue with it 10 years ago. We are now coming to this map, and while it is, we might have to deal with communities that are undercounted. Unfortunately, it is still more reflective of the population today than it was 10 years ago. And one aspect of this. We mentioned the makeup of the caucuses in the legislature, that the Legislative Black Caucus is larger than the proportional percentage in the communities. Here's the thing about that. Representatives of color in any group, that is a good factor and indication to show a problem of representation, but that is not the issue with redistricting. In redistricting, we need to focus on ensuring that communities get to elect who they are choosing, that we are not diluting their power to elect whomever they want. So, and there are all sorts of places, including right here in Newark, where communities of color elect white legislators, and other areas of white communities that elect legislators of color. That is perfectly normal. That is representation working. So it is not necessarily about how many members are in each caucus, although that is a reflection if there is a problem. It is about the actual districts and who are in them.
I'm looking at the questions in the Q&A, and because of time, I'm trying to summarize them. A number of them, and I'll sort of restate the question I asked, but I'll put it more bluntly. If for those who oppose the amendment, let's say it's the be careful what you wish for question. If this referendum were to fail, what do we do? Or, I mean, Professor Wong has suggested, well, then it goes to the New Jersey Supreme Court. And quite frankly, I'll inject this, knowing most of the justices, that is not necessarily a task they would welcome because, and I say this as a lawyer, Assemblyman McKeon has a point. This is quintessentially a legislative policy issue as to which there may not be a judicially manageable standards. It's not necessarily a role the courts are really equipped to engage in. So if this were to fail, and then let's say we get census data, let's say the other shoe drops, and we get census data very late, is it possible that the effective outcome this year might actually be injurious to communities of color, because we'd have a very rushed redistricting sequence in which the ability of particular communities of color to express themselves might be truncated?
Well, I'll take that one, Ron.
Assemblyman, please.
Yeah, so my good friend John McKeon mentioned that maybe I'll become president. And I'm not even the Speaker of the State Assembly yet. But if I were the Speaker of the State Assembly and this question before the voters fails in November, I would certainly believe and I would expect that this issue then comes back to us. It comes back to the legislature. Sure, it could end up in the courts. It could end up in the state courts, or as John said, in the federal courts. But if the question fails before the voters, I would think it would, or perhaps should, come back to us, because one of the contingencies in the legislation, ACR 188, is that it passed the voters. So if I'm a voter and I'm looking at this question in November, I'm going to be confused for a number of reasons. But that is a end result of what could happen if the question does fail at the ballot. I can't say ballot box, but on election day. So,
if I could add something to that response, if you allow me to do so, is that okay?
Please, yes.
So I think that the premise of the question assumes that the redistricting process as it stands adequately allows for communities of color to have a say in it, and it does not. So the truncated process as it stands does not adequately reflect voices of the community. So it's not like we're creating a new problem by defeating this. We're preventing future problems. Decade after decade, we will be faced with this early permanent February 15th deadline. But, the Fair Districts Coalition did ask for several amendments to this particular proposal to try to help with some of these issues, including the inclusion of a racial equity provision, reinforcing the principles of the Voting Rights Act, and protections for communities of interest, some map-making criteria, things that could improve the process long-term, because I don't think it's fair to say that in a process where legislators and political operatives are the majority of the folks drawing these lines with one independent tiebreaker, often behind closed doors, without communities having an opportunity to even comment on the proposed map, is a particularly fair system as it is. So I just wanted to kind of argue with the premise of the question.
Ron, can I just add one thing?
Please, yes.
So again, as to the question for the voters, there are two major contingencies in the resolution. One, of course, the voters have to agree. They have to pass the question in November. But of course, the second major contingency is that the census data does not get delivered by this arbitrary date. So if I'm a voter and I'm looking at the question, perhaps a question that would come to mind is, why are they asking us to decide this if this eventuality does not occur, or does occur, that in fact that the census data is delivered by the 15th. Now, of course, I know what predictions have been made in the past, but you never know what is going to happen. In fact, as to the collection efforts, and I don't think this issue is primarily about census collection per se, but the self-participation rate is ahead of where people just a few months ago predicted it would be. So anything is possible. The census data could be delivered by whatever administration we have by the 15th of February or shortly thereafter. And as others have discussed, perhaps there are less draconian options to pursue at that point, as has been done in the past, as we discussed.
Okay. I'm again scanning the questions, but we are beginning to run out of time. And is that someone I'm going to give you the response to the opportunity to? You're going to play a wrap up in a moment. I'm just looking at the pictures, the questions in the Q&A. A lot of them, I should say, seem to deal with the larger picture that I think both Hannah Patel and Jesse Burns have spoken about, the process and by which we engage in redistricting. And I don't mean to speak for him, but I interpret Assemblyman McKeon's initial remarks as that is a question that he also would be willing to open up. And frankly, a lot of us in this area would want to engage in, and hopefully will be the subject of much greater discussion about the composition of the reapportionment commission, maybe the timing and the transparency of the process. And I hope we can engage in that conversation. It is now 1:21, and we do have a hard stop at 1:30. Therefore, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give each of the panelists the chance maybe to give if they would like, a 1-minute summary, except for Assemblyman McKeon, because again, given that he has been so courteous enough to take on this this debate as the sole proponent, I'll give him the chance to wrap up. So, in particular order, would that panelist like to, other than Assemblyman McKeon, like to make some closing remarks?
Yeah, I will, but I'll let John go first.
Well,
I go last.
Oh,
yeah, I'm going to give him the opportunity to play wrap up since he's outnumbered.
okay. Well, let me just make 2 quick points.
Yeah.
Back on the question before the voters. If it fails in November, to your earlier question, the speaker could call the question back before the State Assembly, Senate President as well. It could come back before the legislature, or frankly, the resolution dies, because the resolution is based upon or assumes that voters would approve. So there'll be no constitutional amendment without voter approval. So it's basically, we're back to square one. It's up to the legislature to decide how to proceed from there. As you and others have said, maybe there'll be litigation, maybe there won't. My final point that I want to make is, before we rush, and these of course were the arguments I made in the Judiciary Committee and on the floor of the State Assembly, but we can make them again. Before we rush to amend the Constitution permanently, why haven't we exhausted less draconian options? Because the primary issue before us in the legislature, and frankly before all of us, is not census collection, not the coronavirus crisis. It is about the principle of equal protection under the law. One person, one vote. Both of those principles are enshrined in our U.S. Constitution. So that is first and foremost our obligation to protect that. And I think just willy-nilly delaying redistricting for 2 years violates that principle. Thank you.
Professor Wong.
Thanks very much. I will say that since I am not a direct advocate or opponent of this and not an elected official, I'm going to use my discretion to be able to change my mind in front of people. And I'm going to say that one thing that Assemblyman McKeon said I thought was pretty important, which is the way, first I would just rephrase it the way I see these things as a data guy. I think the problem we now face is a trade-off between a census undercount for communities of color and having that be used for drawing maps over a period of 10 years. And the counter possibility is waiting 2 years to reflect what we know is a 25% increase in Latino and Asian communities. And so I think it's not really that black and white. I think that there are ways in which there's underrepresentation for communities of color in either direction. And I think that that is a tough situation that we find ourselves in. Just, the fact of the matter is that the die is cast on this particular amendment and we're going to be voting on it. I will reiterate some things that have been said by other panelists, which is that it would be a good idea to address the issue of redistricting reform. I think it's really tough for legislators to give away their own power. And so whatever happens in the future is going to have to reflect the fact that who would do that? Who would give away their own power? And so I think that's a challenge for future years. It's not something we're going to be resolving today or even this November. But I just want to point out that bringing about improvements to the redistricting process is something that's going to require some discussion and thought, and accommodating those who are office holders and who are in a pretty good position now, either them or the governor, in influencing the process. Anyway, thanks to everybody.
Assemblyman McKeon, I don't know if that was just a media event, but that you may have accomplished. But I'll give you the chance to have the last word.
Thank you very much, and again, thanks to all. And listen, I guess I did okay if I've got Professor Wang saying I made a good point, and I even heard you, Dean Chen, said I made a good point as well. So I'm doing all right. Look, I what Chris was saying, go back to that. What happens if this is defeated? It doesn't go back to the legislature. There's a reason why we went with a constitutional amendment, because the current process is imbued in our Constitution. So what happens is that we get the numbers whenever we get them, and then either deal with this compressed process that's going to be as undemocratic as it could possibly be, and depress those who would have an opportunity to run in new districts based upon the practicalities of the situation, let alone to Dr. Wang's point of that we'll deal with bad numbers, and then be stuck for 10 years with an undercounted population versus delaying it and at least having an accurate count in 8 years. That's what happens if this loses. As it relates to equal protection, I hear you, Chris, but equal protection, and I won't bore you with citing all of the case law, is a legal fiction as it comes to redistricting. As a matter of fact, our state Supreme Court has out there that these districts can vary by as much as 10% by population by one to the other. So that doesn't kind of count when it relates to the redistricting process. To the point made by Ms. Patel again, and I appreciate what you were saying. When I ran first 20 years ago, a person of color was on my team, and it was a predominantly Caucasian district, and he was resoundingly elected. And going back to today, frankly, I put my voting record up against anyone in the Black Caucus regarding voting in a way that's supportive of minority districts. So it doesn't. You're right. It goes to character, as Dr. Martin Luther King might have said, as opposed to necessarily, the color of one's skin. I think this is, a very fair and practical solution for what are the most extraordinary of times. 4 years ago, I sponsored a bill that unfortunately wasn't supported by my colleagues to recompose the Redistricting Commission. I'm a believer in that, and I hope that we can collaborate and convince half of our colleagues to do the same in a commission for the future when we get to 10 years more down the line. But again, if we do nothing, it all stays the same. And at a minimum, for all those of you that believe about redistricting, we get a much elongated process. And again, I would be ashamed of the independent, whoever that might be, if they didn't use the opportunity of that time to, at a minimum, take more input and and be more transparent for those, which is all what we all collectively want. Thank you again. You guys are all awesome.
There will be, I believe, a video recording available for this, and the issues with regard to a redistricting election will survive. Hopefully, well, I know we'll survive the pandemic. I hope, and I'm sure will be the subject of a lot further public debate. So, have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.